The story of how a single man brought down one of the most profitable mafia operations in Las Vegas begins far from the neon lights of the Strip, long before casinos became corporate kingdoms, and long before the federal government understood the full extent of who really ran the city. In the 1960s and 70s, Las Vegas was not the polished adult playground that the world now knows. It was a city still half built and half owned, a mosaic of sand, steel, cash, and fear. And the men who controlled it did not wear badges. They wore tailored suits, Chicago shoes, and the kind of smiles that hid the threat of being buried in the desert. The outfit, as the Chicago Mafia was known, had its hands deep in the counting rooms of several Las Vegas casinos, siphoning millions of dollars in unreported cash through a network so complex and so deeply embedded that most dealers, pit bosses, and even casino executives had no idea they were part of a machine designed to bleed the city dry. At the core of this machine were the men who collected, concealed, and transported the skim, money that never made it to the books. But even the tightest machine has a weak bolt, and in the outfit's Vegas empire, that weak bolt had a name: Frank Coletta. Coletta did not begin his life intending to betray the mafia. In fact, he began at the opposite end of the moral spectrum. Raised on the streets of Chicago, a childhood friend of Tony Spilotro, the feared enforcer sent by the outfit to protect and expand their Las Vegas interests. Spilotro was the kind of man mothers warned their sons about, though many sons admired him anyway. He was charismatic, unpredictable, and terrifying. And he carried a reputation that traveled faster than rumors. Kids in Chicago grew up whispering stories about what happened to anyone who crossed him. But for Coletta, Spilotro was more than a neighborhood legend. He was practically family. Their friendship, forged through fights, petty crimes, and early hustles, would eventually bring Coletta to Las Vegas to serve as Spilotro's right-hand man in a city where the lines between business and bloodshed blurred every night.
When Coletta arrived in Vegas, he stepped into a world where casinos were essentially cash factories for the outfit. Quietly, behind the spectacle of showgirls and champagne, men in the back rooms peeled off stacks of bills before the official count, placing the skim into secret bags that would later fly, literally, back to Chicago, Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Cleveland. These Midwestern families, while cooperating, also competed for influence over different casinos. The government would eventually estimate that more than $63 million was stolen through these operations, but insiders believe the real amount was even higher. The more money the casinos made, the more the mafia demanded, and the more violent the consequences became for anyone who threatened the flow. And this is where Tony Spilotro came in. Spilotro was not sent to Vegas to run casinos. He was sent to keep everyone in line. His job was to intimidate, punish, and, if necessary, eliminate anyone who disrupted the skim or dared to cheat the outfit. Under Spilotro's shadow, Coletta formed the so-called hole-in-the-wall gang, a burglary ring specializing in safe-cracking, jewelry theft, and high-end robbery. These activities were not officially sanctioned by the outfit, but Spilotro let them operate because he trusted Coletta and because the profits, when convenient, flowed upward. But the Las Vegas of the late 1970s was changing. The FBI had begun to take a growing interest in the city, especially in the Teamsters loans used to build casinos and the mysterious money disappearing before it hit the books. Agents planted wiretaps, installed hidden microphones, and slowly, methodically, built a picture of how interconnected the mafia families really were. Their attention soon drifted toward Spilotro, whose violent tendencies and increasingly unpredictable actions made him more of a liability than an asset.
Everything began to unravel over something that, at first glance, seemed small: a botched burglary. On July 4, 1981, members of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang attempted to rob Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings. They planned to enter through, you guessed it, the wall, using power tools to cut through the neighboring building. Coletta had stepped back from the operation, but his men went ahead. What they didn't know was that the FBI had been listening for months, tracking their moves. As sparks flew from metal blades, federal agents surrounded the building and arrested the burglars before sunrise. The arrests set off a chain reaction. Suddenly, the FBI had leverage over several members of Spilatra's organization. But the crucial moment came when they brought Collota in for questioning. Collota, who had always trusted Spilatra with his life, knew something had changed. There had been whispers circulating that Tony wanted him taken care of, the mafia's euphemistic way of saying executed. Some said Tony believed Collota knew too much. Others claimed Tony feared Collota's crew had attracted too much attention. Whatever the reason, Collota realized that the man he had once considered a brother might be plotting against him. The FBI, sensing opportunity, pressed harder. They reminded him that the outfit would sacrifice him without hesitation. They listed the charges piling against him: burglary, conspiracy, racketeering, accessory to murder. They told him that if he stayed loyal, he would likely die in prison or in a hole in the desert. Something broke inside him that day. A lifetime of loyalty, built over decades, began to crumble. And when the agents offered him witness protection in exchange for everything he knew, Collota made a decision that would shake the criminal underworld across several states. He flipped.
The FBI could hardly believe their fortune. Collota wasn't just another small-time burglar. He was the man who had been inside rooms where millions were skimmed, inside cars where bodies were discussed, inside conversations where casino bosses begged for mercy. He knew the names, the methods, the routes, the couriers, the casinos, the hidden rooms behind false walls. He knew which families got what percentage of the skim, and he knew which politicians could be counted on to look the other way. For the first time, the government had a witness who could trace the entire pipeline of stolen cash from Las Vegas to the Midwest. The case that would become one of the largest mafia takedowns in American history began with a man sitting in a small, air-conditioned FBI room, gripping a cup of stale coffee, deciding that betraying the outfit was his only chance to survive. What followed was a legal earthquake. Federal prosecutors, armed with Collota's testimony, began assembling charges against members of the Chicago outfit, the Kansas City family, the Milwaukee bosses, and the Cleveland mob. The skim operation, which had always existed in the shadows, now had names, dates, and dollar amounts attached to it. Courtrooms filled with stacks of evidence, wiretap recordings, and witnesses whose fear was only outweighed by their desire to avoid long prison terms. One by one, high-ranking mobsters were convicted. Some received decades-long sentences, others died before charges could be brought. The FBI, once mocked for their limited influence in Las Vegas, now stood as the force that had cracked open a criminal empire, all because one man decided to talk. Collota's testimony didn't just end the skim, it fundamentally changed Las Vegas. The mafia's grip on the casinos loosened, then snapped entirely. Corporate ownership surged in to fill the vacuum. Wall Street investors replaced mobsters. Security systems replaced backroom threats. Counting rooms became heavily monitored zones with cameras and audits instead of envelope drops and quiet nods. The city evolved from a gangster-run oasis to a corporate fortress. And though criminals still found ways to infiltrate its underbelly, the era of multifamily mafia control was effectively over.
But the story didn't end with the trials. Collota, now seen as a traitor by the underworld and a controversial figure among law enforcement, entered witness protection. Yet his past clung to him like a shadow. He lived under assumed identities, moved from city to city, and tried to rebuild a life without constantly looking over his shoulder. But anyone who had ever crossed paths with the outfit knew that betrayal carried a lifetime sentence. Even years later, rumors persisted that the surviving bosses wanted him dead. Somehow, Coletta lived long enough to tell his story publicly, appearing in documentaries and even consulting on films, including Martin Scorsese's Casino, which dramatized the rise and fall of the Vegas mafia empire. It was surreal, watching actors portray events he had lived through, hearing dialogue based on conversations he once believed would be taken to the grave. And perhaps the strangest part of all was knowing that a single decision in an FBI interrogation room had reshaped the history of Las Vegas. The mafia families never fully recovered from the Vegas losses. The millions earned through the skim had funded political corruption, street operations, and bribes that sustained their power across multiple states. When that money disappeared, an entire financial artery was cut. Their influence diminished, their internal alliances fractured, and federal scrutiny only intensified as RICO laws expanded. The fall of Las Vegas was not just a financial blow, it was a symbolic one. It demonstrated that even the strongest crime syndicates, when exposed to enough pressure, could collapse from within. Coletta's betrayal also forced mobsters across the country to reconsider the loyalty they assumed was unbreakable. The old codes of silence, once treated as sacred, were suddenly vulnerable. Informants multiplied. The FBI nurtured this trend, recognizing that the best weapon against the mafia was the mafia itself. By the end of the 1980s, dozens of high-ranking figures had flipped, each hoping to save themselves the way Coletta had.
But for all his cooperation, Coletta lived with a truth he could never escape. He had destroyed the life of the man who once saved his. Tony Spilotro, stripped of protection and seen as a liability by the outfit, was murdered in 1986 alongside his brother Michael. Their bodies were discovered buried in an Indiana cornfield, beaten so severely they were unrecognizable. Many believe the killings were retribution not just for Spilotro's mismanagement, but for creating the circumstances that pushed Coletta into becoming a government witness. If loyalty is the mafia's most prized value, then betrayal is its most unforgivable crime. And yet, in the end, both men were betrayed, one by his closest friend, the other by the organization he risked everything for. As Vegas continued to reinvent itself, first as a family destination, later as a luxury playground, the ghosts of its mafia past lingered beneath the glitter. Every major casino that stands today owes part of its history to the battles fought in back rooms, parking lots, and desert clearings decades earlier. And while tourists wander through themed resorts and billion-dollar video screens, few realize that the city once balanced on the edge of a knife held by men whose names inspired terror across half the country. Coletta eventually died of natural causes, an ending that would have seemed impossible during the bloody height of Las Vegas's underworld era. He outlived almost everyone who wanted him dead, surviving long enough to watch the mafia's power crumble and corporate empires rise in its place. But the story of how one snitch destroyed a $63 million operation remains one of the most extraordinary examples of how fragile criminal empires truly are. It shows that sometimes the downfall of an entire system does not come from outside forces or heroic investigators, but from one frightened, cornered man deciding that silence was no longer worth dying for. And that is how a single voice, trembling under the pressure of decades of violence and paranoia, brought an empire to its knees, forever reshaping the city that once glittered under the mob's watchful gaze.